and good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar on diet and MS, clinical research and practical meal planning. This webinar series is brought to you by Can Do Multiple Sclerosis, the National MS Society, and the MS Society of Canada. So we have Ilana Katz-Sand, who is a neurologist in New York City, and Stephanie Singleton, who is an occupational therapist in New Mexico. And I'm going to let them go ahead and introduce themselves, starting with Ilana.
Great. Thanks so much, Brian. So my name is Ilana Katz-Sand. As Brian mentioned, I'm a neurologist at the Corinne Goldsmith Dickinson Center for MS at Mount Sinai in New York. I take care of patients with MS, and I do clinical and translational research. My focus is on modifiable risk factors in MS, and in particular, I have a very strong interest, obviously while we're here tonight, in diet and the gut microbiota. And now I will leave it to Stephanie to introduce herself.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Singleton, and I'm an occupational therapist. I've been an occupational therapist for 30 years, and I work in outpatient at this current time. And I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you.
Okay, great. So now we'll move ahead. So I will start off our discussion this evening by talking to you for a bit about the role of diet in MS. And we're going to focus on what is the current evidence for dietary factors in MS. I'll talk to you a little bit about our own research and kind of future directions. So just by way of an overview, first we'll start by talking about the rationale for our interest in the role of diet in MS. We'll look at some potential contributory mechanisms for how we think diet may influence MS, including mechanisms that are mediated through gut microbiota. We'll then move on to talking about current evidence for particular dietary components as well as dietary patterns in MS. Then we'll talk a bit about why dietary research is so difficult in MS. What are some of those barriers that we've been facing in terms of doing really good clinical research in diet and MS? And then I'll finish up by telling you a bit about some preliminary results of our own recently completed pilot clinical trial of a dietary intervention in MS patients. Okay. So first of all, why are we interested in diet? Well, I can tell you that from the clinician's perspective, I always think that I should be interested, and all of us as clinicians should be interested in anything that our patients demonstrate an interest in. And diet is something that I was very impressed by patient interest in from the time I first started doing this about 7-8 years ago. And almost every patient visit that I went into, new patients would be asking us, well, what can I do? You know, how can I be proactive about this? And we know from survey studies that people with MS are really interested in diet. I think it's really important that we give our patients tools to be able to think about and be proactive in their own health and do something where they can actively do something. I think the idea of diet as a more natural approach is also really great. I definitely treat my patients with disease-modifying therapies, and those are really important. But I think the idea of a more natural approach is also really appealing to a lot of people. Coming at it from the other end, there's increasing scientific rationale for why we really should be studying diet. So we know that there's a strong environmental component to MS, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But that means that we really should be looking hard at what are the different factors in our environment that we can use to our advantage to positively impact people who have MS. There's been some good research recently demonstrating that obesity, particularly in childhood and adolescence, is a risk factor for MS and affects MS prognosis. And there are obvious connections between body weight and diet. And then furthermore, there's been some really good basic science research, some of which I'll tell you about this evening, showing us that there are potential mechanistic links by which we can really tie diet to outcomes in MS, which was kind of a missing thing in the field until fairly recently, including links through the gut microbiota. So thinking about the cause of MS, we know that there probably is no one particular cause for MS, but rather it's a collection of factors. And it's a combination between a genetic predisposition and environmental factors. And then thinking through the environmental factors, we've identified a few of them. We know that smoking is a risk factor for MS, having a low vitamin D level, being exposed to certain viruses. And as I mentioned, we now know that obesity in childhood and adolescence seems to be a risk factor. In addition, we also know that each of these factors plays a role in MS prognosis. So we know that some people with MS are affected in a way that's kind of mild, and some people with MS are affected in a way that's really severe. And even if two patients get the same treatment, one of them might respond really well while the other doesn't, and we really don't have a good understanding of why that is. And so I think that makes it really important for us as clinicians and researchers to be delving further into what are the factors in the environment that contribute to these differences, and how can we use them to our advantage to benefit all people who are living with MS. So this means that we really should be asking this question. So where should we look? What kinds of environmental things should we look at besides the factors that I have listed here? Well, to me, the gut is a really natural place to look, actually. And that's for several reasons. First of all, about 70% of our body's entire immune system lives inside the gut. And there are really important interactions that happen between everything that comes in through the gut, what's already in the gut in terms of the bacteria there, and we'll talk about that more in a few minutes. And those interactions there affect the local immune system. They affect the immune system throughout the body. There are molecules that come in through the diet or that are being produced in the gut that are able to go throughout the bloodstream and have distant effects on the entire body. So to me, it actually makes a lot of sense that we should be looking at the gut, even though as neurologists, it's not something we're trained to really be thinking about. So let's think a little bit about food and diet. So we don't often think about food this way, but I think we should, particularly in this setting. So foods really are composed of bioactive compounds, and they have structures, chemical structures, the same way when we think about how medications work, pharmacology, and the way things with different chemical structures are going to bind differently to receptors on cells and have different effects in the body. Different foods have different structures, and they're going to have different effects through the body, and we really should be thinking about foods in this way. So let's think about it from a mechanistic standpoint. How can foods have an effect on MS outcomes? There's a couple of different ways we can break this down. One way is thinking about, in general, how can MS outcomes be affected? So the first way is in terms of effects on the immune system. We know that MS is, at least in part, an autoimmune disease, right? We know that the immune systems of people with MS tend to be a little bit overactive. So if there are compounds that we can derive from the diet that can favor regulating the immune system rather than overactivity, that's potentially very helpful. In addition, we know that MS is also not only an autoimmune disease, but also a neurodegenerative disease. And so if there are compounds that are derived from foods that can be neuroprotective, that can either protect that myelin that we know gets damaged in MS, or that can protect the nerves themselves, or that can encourage repair. We know that the body has natural repair mechanisms in terms of remyelination, for example, but that those mechanisms need a boost, need some encouragement, especially when people have had MS for a long time. And so if we can encourage those processes through foods, that's potentially very helpful. So another way we can break things down is thinking about direct versus indirect effects for mechanisms. So indirect effects by diet would be mediated through comorbidities that I had alluded to earlier that we know to be associated with worse outcomes in MS. So we know there's some good research at this point demonstrating to us that having a body weight that's ideal is really best, and that being overweight tends to impact MS negatively over the long term. We also know that having cholesterol level that's too high, particularly certain subtypes of cholesterol that we'll talk about a little bit later in terms of certain dietary factors, in the same way, linked to negative outcomes in MS. And having other vascular risk factors like diabetes or high blood pressure also can have a negative impact on MS. And of course, those things are all tied to diet. So diet can definitely have indirect effects mediated by those factors. I think what's even more interesting, and most of what we're going to focus on tonight, is the effects of dietary components that are more direct. So we can have direct effects of dietary metabolites, right? Thinking back to that slide I showed you earlier about foods as bioactive compounds with chemical structures, and thinking about the way foods are broken down by the digestive system and the way those metabolites are distributed through the bloodstream and through the body. So those direct effects. And then another mechanism which I want to mention and we'll kind of allude to throughout, but I'm not going to focus on tonight because we actually did a separate webinar on this a few months back that everyone can access if they'd like. I'm happy to answer questions about it, but I at least want to mention it because I think it's important. Are effects that are mediated not from the dietary metabolites themselves, but through the gut microbiota. So it's not really so nice to think about, but we are all colonized with trillions of bacteria. And inside the gut live trillions of bacteria, and everyone's bacterial composition is a little bit different. It's actually as unique, your gut microbiota, your stamp of your gut microbiota is as unique as your fingerprint, actually. And gut microbiota are really highly influenced by the diet. We know that different dietary inputs have effects on the composition of the bacteria that live in the gut. And different bacteria can have different effects in terms of the way they interact with the immune system. And again, whether they favor inflammation or whether they're anti-inflammatory. In addition, the intake of different dietary factors can lead those gut microbiota that live there to produce different metabolites. So having an intake of something that's high in fiber versus something that's high in sugar is going to lead to the production of different metabolites by those bacteria. And we think that has important effects as well. Okay, so now let's get into some evidence for particular dietary components in MS. The first thing we're going to talk about is fats. 3 different kinds of fats that I'm sure people are familiar with these terms and seeing them on food labels and things. So first is saturated fats, which are found mostly in animal products, meat, and dairy. Next is polyunsaturated fats, found in things like walnuts, flax seeds, fish, and in particular, we'll talk a little bit about omega-3 fatty acids, which can be derived from fish or they can be plant-based. And then monounsaturated fats, which are found in things like olive oil, avocado, peanuts. And the difference between these different things and talking about saturation really just has to do with, again, the chemical structure of the fats and thinking about the carbon backbone and whether things, you guys can remember back to like high school chemistry, whether there's single bonds or double bonds, but this is the way that fatty acids are classified. Okay, so thinking about saturated fats. We know that saturated fats have the ability to raise LDL or quote bad cholesterol, which as I mentioned earlier has been associated with poorer outcomes in MS. We know that saturated fats also are able to activate certain pro-inflammatory pathways. We've learned that from some basic science research. And then what I'll show you in this panel here on the right is that one of the things we're going to talk about in several of these categories is what kind of animal model research has been done. So there are mouse models where we are able to use mice to try to simulate MS. And so we know from animal model studies that if we feed them diets that are high in saturated fat, they have worse looking mouse MS than if we look at the animals who were fed kind of a regular diet. And you can see that demonstrated in this panel to the right. On the y-axis there where you see numbers 1, 2, and 3, those are the clinical scores for how the mice are doing, with a higher score being worse disease. And you can see with that top line there that the mice who were fed a diet high in saturated fat had worse outcomes, had worse, mouse version of MS than the mice who were fed a control diet. So we think that's that's pretty significant. In addition, when we look a little further, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the clinical studies. So what does it look like when we look at saturated fats in people with MS, not just in mice, right? Because mice are helpful as models, but they're not the same as people. So the first study we'll talk about, I'm sure some people are familiar with the work of Dr. Swank. Dr. Swank was really a pioneer in this field. He really was the first one to really think that diet may be of importance in MS, and he started doing this work way back in the 1950s. He did a couple of different observational studies regarding ties to dietary factors and observations in MS, and then based on that work, he actually started an interventional study of a low-fat, particularly low-saturated fat diet, which he started in the 1950s. And the way he did his study is interesting. Unfortunately, because of the study design, the results are kind of hard to interpret. But again, for the time in which this was done, it really was, I think, pioneering work. What he did was he had a group of MS patients, and he said to them, I think you should all follow this diet of low saturated fat intake, and you should, log things and really try and stick to it. Over time, people kind of self-selected, and some people followed the diet and some people didn't. So he called those who followed the diet, quote, good dieters, and people who did not follow the diet, poor dieters. Now, there's a lot of biases that get introduced when you do a study this way, right? When we do studies, we don't allow people to choose their own groups, we assign them. And that's because if you allow people to choose their own groups, there's going to be a lot of other things that are also different about the groups besides the one thing you're trying to study, right? But I still think this work is interesting from an observational standpoint. So if you look at the two boxes here that I have highlighted, you will notice that when he looked at these patients almost 35 years later, of those who ended up in the group with minimal disability, almost all of them were, quote, good dieters, or people who had actually stuck to the diet. And very few of the people who were what he called poor dieters ended up in that minimal disability category. So people who were the, quote, good dieters kind of ended up evenly distributed. There were certainly still people who followed the diet who ended up in that category of severe disability. But if you look at it on a percentage basis, it's really far less. And so I think this is an interesting observation and worthy of further study. Next, I'll tell you a little bit about a prospective pediatric MS study. We'll talk about this particular cohort a couple of times throughout some of the different dietary factors. This particular group looked at over 200 children with MS, and they followed them for about 2 years. And what they noted was that while they were following these children over 2 years, for every 10% increase of their calories that came from saturated fat, their risk of relapse was increased more than 3 times. So that's a pretty significant finding. It doesn't establish that that's, definitely the cause, but it definitely shows you that there's a link there. So again, I think interesting for further study. Next, we'll talk for a moment about polyunsaturated fats. So as I had mentioned earlier, these are found in foods like fish, walnuts, flax seeds. We know from animal model studies that there are important effects of polyunsaturated fats on the immune system. They seem to have neuroprotective effects, and they have important effects on remyelination and repair. However, the human studies so far have been kind of conflicting. So first, some epidemiologic studies where we look at large groups, and those results have been kind of conflicting. So one study that used the nurses' health cohort, where thousands of nurses enrolled in this cohort and gave information about their health over time and their habits over time, those studies suggested a link between the onset of MS and intake of a plant-based polyunsaturated fat called alpha-linolenic acid, or ALA. So that was interesting, but other cohort studies have demonstrated a link not with ALA, but rather with other polyunsaturated fats, particularly those that are derived from fish, omega-3 fatty acids. And so, the results don't exactly align there, making it hard to interpret. There's been a little bit of work done in terms of clinical trials of polyunsaturated fat supplements, but those have been kind of small and really not that informative. The results have been kind of mixed. So definitely more work to do in here. Next, looking at monounsaturated fats, which, as I had mentioned, these are found in olive oil, avocados, peanuts. There's actually quite a lot of overlap in terms of the foods where you find high monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fat content. There's some evidence in the aging literature, particularly when you look at cognitive aging and Alzheimer's, that suggests that olive oil, for example, seems to be one of the driving factors behind the benefits of a Mediterranean diet. And so we think that these fats in particular may be neuroprotective. In our own cohort of patients with early MS, we have a cohort of the point at which this data was analyzed was probably about 150 patients. We found an association between the intake of monounsaturated fats and cortical thickness, which is a measure of brain atrophy. So higher cortical thickness is better. So if you look at this graph that's on the right here, you will see that those who had a low intake of monounsaturated fats had a lower cortical thickness compared to people who had a higher intake of monounsaturated fats. Of course, again, this doesn't establish that that's a causative relationship, but it does, again, establish an association that's worthy of further study. So moving on to fruits and vegetables. We think that fruits and vegetables may be of benefit in people with MS for several reasons. One is from a mechanistic standpoint. We've learned from basic science studies that the intake of fiber seems to be of benefit from an inflammatory standpoint. And that's because the intake of fiber seems to induce those gut microbiota, the bacteria that live in the gut, to produce something called short-chain fatty acids, which we know have local effects in the gut in terms of communicating with the local immune system, and are also able to diffuse out into the circulation and even to get into the brain. So we think that that's one mechanism by which fruits and vegetables may be of importance. Another is thinking about the structure of some of these compounds, flavonoids. People may have heard of flavonoids, polyphenols. These are present in brightly colored fruits and vegetables. You'll also be happy to know they're present also in red wine and dark chocolate and coffee and things that a lot of people tend to enjoy. And we think flavonoids have effects on, from animal model studies, we know that they have important effects on the immune system and again also on neuroprotection and repair. I think a really interesting example of a mechanism that I think it's really actually quite exciting, this work that was done very recently, is that tryptophan, which is an amino acid derived, in this case, from the diet. This investigators were able to show this in some very nice animal model and in vitro models. Tryptophan derived from the diet from cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, can actually be processed into metabolites by the gut microbiota, by those bacteria that live in the gut, and then can diffuse into the bloodstream, go from the bloodstream across the blood-brain barrier into the brain, and bind to this particular receptor called AHR inside the brain on cells that are supportive in the brain called astrocytes, and regulate how the astrocytes behave. In particular, they're able to regulate these anti-inflammatory pathways, basically. And so having this mechanism worked out it just further support that we really should be further investigating the diet and these factors and how important they may be in MS. So thinking about this from a more clinical standpoint, coming back to that pediatric MS study that I told you about earlier, where they found an increase in risk for relapses in people who had a high saturated fat intake. Also in the same study, they found that a 1 cup equivalent increase in vegetable intake decreased the risk of relapse over that 2-year period by 50%, which is huge. I mean, that's on the order of what we see from our fairly effective disease-modifying therapies in MS. So that, I think, is a really exciting finding. Again, it's an observation, not a clinical trial, but I think, again, worthy of further investigation. In addition, a registry-based study, I'll tell you a little bit more about that study design a little bit later, but a registry-based study found also a link between a higher intake of fruits and vegetables and patient-reported disability and disease activity scales. Grains is one of the topics that I hear a lot about from patients. I think there's a lot of debate and people wonder about gluten. Really, there's not been a lot of work done at all in MS looking at grains. NARCOMS, which is one of the registry studies we'll talk about, found an association between a higher intake of whole grains and a lower level of MS-related disability. So in that study, whole grains seem to be protective. We think that that mechanism may involve a high fiber content. So again, we were just talking about fruits and vegetables and fiber, but really anything that has high fiber has the potential, we think, to be a benefit from a mechanistic standpoint, because again, it induces those gut microbiota, those bacteria, to produce short-chain fatty acids, which we know to be anti-inflammatory. But really very little work has been done looking at grains. Dairy is also a question I get quite a lot during visits. And again, very little work has been done looking at dairy. So in terms of basic science research, there's a study that was done many years ago, actually, that looked at immune cell reactivities in MS patients and found that if you exposed MS patients to milk antigens in the way that we can do kind of allergy testing, if you see that panel on the right there, people with MS, represented by those top lines there, as compared to people who did not have any autoimmune disease, if you look at it along the bottom where it says healthy controls, seem to have a heightened response to some of these milk antigens. And so it's possible that cow's milk is revving up the immune system in some way. That's the theory behind this. And some people think that this may be related to a specific protein called butyrophilin, which from a chemical structure standpoint has some similarity to myelin. So perhaps exposure to butyrophilin is kind of stirring up the immune system to go against myelin. That's kind of this is a theory, but this is something that has not been proven at all in clinical studies. There's also some work that's been done in inflammatory bowel disease that suggests that increased inflammation might be in some part mediated through the gut microbiome. There have been some registry studies that have looked at dairy, but the results have been very mixed. So the Nurses' Health study that I told you about earlier seemed to suggest that higher milk intake may be associated with the onset of MS, but then the NARCOM study registry seemed to show that dairy intake may actually be protective and helpful. So again, we really just don't know. We really need to do some more work on this topic. Okay, so moving on to talk about salt. So we know from basic science studies that high salt intake seems to encourage the development of more pro-inflammatory immune cells. It's not only the number of pro-inflammatory immune cells, but it's also their function. So we also know that pro-inflammatory immune cells that are developed in a high salt environment demonstrate a more aggressive phenotype. And in particular, studies looking at animal models of MS show that if you feed the mice a high salt diet, they have a worse disease course than mice who are not fed a high salt diet. Looking at MS patients, and the thing that kind of started all this talk about salt is the study that came out a few years ago, which looked at 70 patients with MS and stratified them by their salt intake. And I'll show you that on the next slide. So what they found in this particular study is, you can see highlighted in this box here, right above the box is patients who had less than 2 grams of salt intake per day, which is the American Heart Association recommendation for less than 2 grams per day. So that was considered a low salt intake and used as a reference. And then you can see in that box, people who consumed 2 to 4.8 grams of salt per day. So that was medium intake. And then right below that, high intake, more than 4.8 grams per day. And what you can see in the next column over is the risk, the number of fold times for relapse. So you can see that people who were in that medium salt intake group had 2.5 times the risk of relapse, and people who were in the high salt group had more than 3 times the risk of relapse over the follow-up period as compared to people who had a low salt intake. So that kind of provoked a lot of interest in this topic in the field. But just to thicken the plot a little bit, additional studies have not confirmed these effects. So if we look at a pediatric case control study, which is where they look at people with MS and compare them to people without MS and see if there's anything different about the group. So this study used a food frequency questionnaire to try to estimate how much salt people had as their intake, and they found no difference between people with MS and people without. In addition, the pediatric study that I've told you about a few times now, and some of the different dietary factors, found no link between relapse rates and sodium intake. Remember, they had found a link between saturated fat intake and vegetable intake, but they found no link between sodium intake and relapses in MS. And then another clinical trial, this was not a trial done of sodium. This is an older clinical trial for MS medication, but that clinical trial that had all this nice data collected on all the participants happened to have collected urine samples. And they had about, on average, 14 urine samples per participant. So they were able to estimate the sodium that was taken in by the diet in that way. And when they did that, they found absolutely no link between dietary sodium and clinical relapses or even MRI lesions. So again, this kind of leaves us scratching our heads as to whether this is a real effect or not. So moving past individual components, now we'll look at some evidence for dietary patterns in MS. So this is, I would say, probably a question I get most frequently, rather than just components, is, you know, I've read about all of these things, I've seen all of these different diets and these different books, and my friend suggested the Walls Protocol, or my friend suggested Dr. Jelinek book, and they're all so different, and which one is right, and how do we know which one is right, and what's the evidence behind it? So let's look at a couple of different patterns and what evidence we do have, and I'll tell you what evidence we don't have. So the first thing we'll look at is overall diet quality. So this is, I think, probably the strongest evidence because it's been studied in a way that's a little bit more scientific than some of the others. So two registries here, which we've mentioned a little bit along the way. One is the Holism study, which has over 2,000 MS participants, and everyone in the study completed this diet habits questionnaire. And what they found in this study is that for every 10-point increase in the dietary habit questionnaire, which higher scores indicate a, quote, healthier diet, there was a 30% less likelihood of a high disability level. In addition, those higher scores were associated with better physical and mental health-related quality of life. Similarly, the NARCOMS registry, so North American registry that has about almost 7,000 MS participants in it, completed a dietary screener questionnaire. And again, those who had top diet quality scores were 20% lower odds of a high disability score compared to those who were in the bottom range. So we think that overall diet quality is probably important. The Walls diet is a question I get all the time. If this is a modified paleo diet, there are a lot of versions of paleo diets, but in general, they tend to include certain meats and fish, certain vegetables and fruits. They tend to eliminate dairy and grains. And what I can tell you is really that the evidence behind it is not strong, in that the work just hasn't been done. So I'm happy to report that Dr. Walls and her team are currently in the process of doing, I think, a pretty interesting study, trying to look at this in a more scientific fashion. But as of right now, there's really been only one study published on this topic, which was extremely small, only 6 patients who completed the study. So really not a lot of evidence, but hopefully some more coming soon. My colleagues at OHSU in Portland, Oregon have been studying the McDougall diet. And I think a lot of their reasoning for studying this has to do with Dr. Swank and the low saturated fat diet that I told you about earlier and the evidence for that. And the McDougall diet is based on the intake of starchy plant-based foods, some non-starchy vegetables and fruits, but the idea behind it is that it's a very, very low-fat diet, 10% or less of energy intake from fats, no animal products at all or any oils, including plant-based oils like olive oil. And there was one study that's been published looking at the McDougall diet in MS, where they randomly assigned about 60 patients to either follow the diet or be a weightless control for about a year. Their primary endpoint was looking at new lesions on MRI. They did not meet that endpoint, but to be honest, I think the study design was kind of challenging. I think it was really hard for them to figure out how many patients they really needed to do or how long the study needed to be, and I think they had a hard time with that. There was a significant reduction in fatigue, which seemed to be moderated by weight loss, and I'm excited to report that they are currently doing a study funded by the National MS Society that's going to be focused on fatigue, which I think should be really interesting. So some of my colleagues are also studying caloric restriction and intermittent fasting. So chronic caloric restriction as well as this fasting mimicking diet seem to have benefits in MS animal models. The fasting mimicking diet is, rather than just restricting calories all the time, it's usually intermittent fasting. So people will do a lot of times this 5 and 2 model, where there's 5 days in the week of eating the calories that are needed to maintain body weight, and then 2 days in the week where people fast and eat less than 500 calories per day, which is tough to do. But at least in animal model studies, there's some pretty good evidence for regulating the immune system and for promoting neuroprotection and repair. And there are current studies going on in MS patients of both of these models, so stay tuned for more information on that. So the next question is, why hasn't there been more dietary research in MS? So again, I was struck by this when I first started working with MS patients about how often these questions came up and how little we had to tell people. And what I learned is when I tried to start doing this research myself, I learned the answer, which is that it's really hard. So by comparison, pharmaceutical trials seem really easy because we have pills or we have infusions and we give them out and we know how to sign people up and we know how to monitor if they're taking them. We can blind the studies, but studying diet is really a lot more challenging. So let me tell you a little bit about some of the barriers to developing a proper dietary study in MS and how we've tried to address them in our study. So the first question was, is recruitment feasible? So we know a lot of our patients had told us, they're very interested in diet and learning more, but the question remained, okay, when people actually are asked to sign up and to say they're willing to really rearrange their entire lives, to be part of a study, are people actually going to be able to commit to that? We weren't sure if people would be able to follow a diet that we're going to prescribe to them. How are they going to be able to adhere to it? How can we promote that adherence? Are we going to be able to measure whether people really stick to the diet? The biological markers that are available in blood and urine and stool are really not fantastic. We can use self-reported data, but there are a lot of biases, as we talked about earlier, when you use things that are self-report. Thinking about, a control group. Whenever we do a study, there always has to be a control group for us to be able to show that the intervention we're doing is better than not making that change. And that's, I think, very challenging in dietary work. Other barriers that we faced. So as I mentioned, and as I'm sure a lot of people are aware, when we do a pharmaceutical trial, we usually blind the group so that the patient doesn't know what they're getting, the doctor doesn't know what they're getting, nobody knows, and then at the end, we can kind of see how the different groups did. Well, of course, we can't do that in diet. Everyone's going to know what they're eating. It's also a challenge to figure out what kind of diet should be studied. Should we be studying these popular diets that are out there on the internet and in books, or should we be coming up with our own diet? Should we be looking at individual dietary components, like should we just be doing a trial of a low-salt diet? Or should we be looking at overall dietary patterns? Should the food be prepared by the study so that we know exactly what people are eating? Or is it better to be done by participants where we can demonstrate that we can do this through education? An issue that came up in one of the studies I mentioned was, what are the appropriate endpoints for the study and how large does the study need to be? And so lots and lots of questions that we need to really start working on. So let me tell you a little bit about what we've done recently. We decided, these are all really tough questions, but we need to start answering them. And so we need to just start somewhere and we'll learn from it and we'll go from there. So that's what we've done. And what we designed is a modified Mediterranean diet, and we randomly assigned women with MS to either follow or not follow the dietary intervention for 6 months. So the way we devised this diet is we thought about those things that I just presented to you in the different categories and which things were likely to be of benefit or not of benefit in MS based on best available evidence. We also wanted to come up with a diet that we thought people would be able to follow from a feasibility standpoint. We also wanted to come up with a diet that we thought would be good for people's overall health. Because as we mentioned, having, a diet that would be bad for those comorbidities like obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure would not be good for MS. In addition, we have to think of everyone as whole people. And not be thinking about this in isolation, but actually be thinking about what is the individual's overall health going to look like, right? So we came up with this modified Mediterranean diet. It encouraged foods that were high in mono and polyunsaturated fatty acids with high fiber content, so fruits, vegetables, whole grains. We had no meat and no dairy. We limited salt, which we were able to do by eliminating processed foods. We did this through intensive training with nutritionists and with myself when we gave the group handouts with menus and recipes and grocery lists. We had monthly group meetings and then contact between meetings for questions. We did a whole bunch of different adherence assessments, and then we looked at things like fatigue and quality of life in an exploratory fashion, and we also collected specimens. So I'm very excited to report that our target enrollment was for us to be able to enroll 30 participants at our single center in about a year, which we thought was pretty ambitious. We screened 131 potential participants over 9 months, and we found 36 of them were eligible and willing to participate. So we were very pleased with that. We were even more pleased that all 18 out of 18 in the dietary intervention group completed the study, 16 out of 18 in the non-intervention group, which gave us an overall completion rate of about 94%, which is really wonderful for a 6-month study. Most pharma studies don't get adherence rates that high in terms of dropout. The self-reported level of adherence to the diet at 6 months was about 90%, which we thought was excellent. And we have a lot of additional adherence data that's pending that we'll be going through over the next few months. So let me tell you a bit about what happened with the diet. People who followed the diet for 6 months, although we gave them no advice on calories, they did tend to lose a little bit of weight at a healthy pace of about 1 pound per month, whereas the group who were not part of the dietary intervention, their weight stayed about stable. Some people gained about an average of 1 pound. The thing we were most excited about is that even though this was a very small study, we only had 18 participants who followed the diet, and we didn't require people to have fatigue to get into the study, we found a significant reduction in fatigue in those who followed the diet. Those who did not follow the diet either had kind of overall stable or maybe slightly increased level of fatigue in the 6 months in which they were followed, whereas those who followed the diet, on average, had a several point decrease in their fatigue scale over the 6 months. So we were very excited about that. In addition, we found that when we looked at a questionnaire called the MS Impact Scale 29, it's a 29-item questionnaire that asks about the impact of MS symptoms on daily life. Again, we found that people who did not follow the diet, their score stayed about stable, maybe increased slightly, indicating slightly worse, whereas on average, those who were part of the dietary intervention group had a decrease in the impact of their MS symptoms over the 6 months. So we were pretty excited about that. We still have a lot of work to do in sorting through the data on this study. So we have additional adherence data to look at. We did formal cognitive testing, and we have to look at that more closely. And then we have a lot of blood samples, and we have stool samples to look at in terms of how this diet affected the gut microbiota. Going forward, we have a lot of ideas for what we can do with this research next. We'd like to do a larger study specifically designed to look at fatigue and other MS symptoms. In addition, we're really interested in this diet as in terms of its potential as a disease modifier. So we're interested to see what's going to happen in terms of MRI outcomes and clinical outcomes. So to conclude, we have, I think, really strong patient-driven as well as scientific rationale for interest in the role of diet in MS. There's multiple, at this point, contributory mechanisms for dietary influence in MS, including those mediated through the gut microbiota. We have limited evidence at this point for a role for particular dietary factors and patterns on MS outcomes. There are quite a few barriers to studying diet in MS, which we're going to have to just keep working on overcoming in future research. Preliminarily, we have found that a modified Mediterranean dietary intervention seems to reduce fatigue and the impact of MS symptoms, and we know that we have a lot more work to do, so we're going to keep on it. So I'd like to acknowledge all of my collaborators at Mount Sinai and outside who've helped me do this work. Most importantly, really, is our patients and their families for being willing to participate. And of course, I would like to thank the NMSS, the National MS Society, for funding this work. And thank you so much to Can Do MS and NMSS and the MS Society of Canada for asking me to be part of this evening. You can see some of the references listed here. And I will turn it over to Stephanie at this point.
Oops, sorry. So thank you, Dr. Katz-Sand, for providing us with the latest information on clinical research regarding diet and multiple sclerosis. I found your presentation to be very informative. So now we're going to take a turn and we're going to discuss the practical tips that you can implement for use in your meal preparation activities. As an occupational therapist, the following slides are just some of the things that I discuss with my clients in order to help them increase their participation in meal planning and preparation. It should be noted that this is only a starting point, not a comprehensive list. So on this first slide, the first thing that I would recommend that you do would be to complete an honest evaluation of your skills and your deficits that relate to how MS impacts your daily function. With that being said, MS can impact a variety of areas. Some of those areas can include fatigue, sensation, balance, cognition, fine motor skills, and issues with overall strength. After you have completed this evaluation of yourself and your skills and deficits, it could be helpful if you were to review this with your care partner or family member, as they may have some insight into possible areas of difficulty as well. We'll review these and talk about some compensatory strategies in the following slides. After you have completed your self-evaluation, did you note that you have issues with cognition? For example, do you get easily distracted by other things that are going on around you and then have difficulty in getting back onto task? Do you have difficulty keeping track of what items in the recipe you have already used? Do you have difficulty remembering how long something has been cooking? These are just a few examples of how issues with cognition can impact your cooking skills. If cognition is an area where you have problems, here are a few compensatory strategies that you can implement into your cooking tasks. There are a variety of apps that you can add to your phone or tablet that help you with organization and memory while you are cooking. A few examples of free apps include Yumly, that's Y-U-M-M-L-Y, recipes and shopping lists, and Big Oven, which also has a meal planning function, a grocery list tool, and an organizational tool. And Food.com, where you can easily build menus while you have grocery lists populated. There are also free apps that you can use as timers and to assist you in organizing your recipes. Another thing that you can do is to try using recipes with fewer ingredients or fewer steps. This reduces problems that you might have with attention. You can use a slow cooker instead of the stovetop or oven. This reduces heat in the kitchen and can also make cleanup easier. It's good to have a variety of timers available. The timer can be used to tell you when to turn things off, help you stay on track, and when you need to check things. It can also help with when you need to take a rest break, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Using a microwave or toaster oven can make cooking easier and safer. The microwave can be a great way to reheat items, thaw items, or keep things warm once they've been cooked. A toaster oven can be used to cook smaller items and also helps keep the kitchen cooler instead of using the large oven. It's important to make a list of what you need to do and check those items off when you're completing the activity so that you can stay on track of what has already been done. Oops, sorry about that. Do you have, Issues with community and mobility skills. This can be a major factor in what you cook. Don't let these issues stop you from healthy eating. Some compensatory strategies to use when you have decreased community mobility skills include using your handicap placard for parking outside of the store so you don't spend as much energy getting into the store. You want to be able to get in, get around the store, have energy left to check out, and get back to your car. Once inside the store, use a motorized scooter to obtain your groceries. If you don't see one, which also happens, ask a store employee to assist you in finding one. If it is too hard for you to get around in the store, try using delivery or pickup services that many stores now offer. You can also try shopping at one of the smaller stores where it's easier to find the items. Knowing where the items you frequently get in the store are located and using an organized approach to obtain them will help you decrease the need to go back and forth across the store. You can also try shopping at the time of day that you have more energy instead of after you have already completed a number of activities. It is also possible to try and shop at the time of day when there are less people in the store. The picture on the right of this screen is an example of a page from a daily planner. You can use something similar to this to plan and prioritize your daily activities. Okay, so looking at this slide, probably the better questions for this would be, who with MS doesn't have issues with fatigue? For those people who do have problems with fatigue, impacting their ability to participate in meal planning and preparation activities, the following strategies can be helpful in reducing the amount of energy that is spent during cooking activities. For example, sit to complete as much of the meal preparation process as possible. Standing just takes more energy. Try cooking bigger meals on days when you don't have as many things to do. Freeze foods or meals so that you have healthy foods available to you on the days that you have less energy or more activities that you need to complete. Try cooking a meal with someone so you can divide and conquer the process by making it into smaller and more manageable steps. Remember, whenever it is possible, to slide items along the countertop instead of lifting and carrying them. When you're doing your cleanup, make sure to soak your pots and pans in order to eliminate the need for scrubbing them after they've been used. Use a powered device like the can opener that is pictured here instead of using manual devices. Powered devices take less effort to use. Think about investing in silicone cooking liners, like in the picture below, to decrease the mess when baking. It makes easier cleanup. You can try using pre-chopped fresh and frozen items, fruits and vegetables, from your store that they have to offer so you don't have to spend as much time and energy chopping things. And finally, smile while you're cooking. Finding pleasure in the activity and smiling while working takes less energy. So, during your self-evaluation of your skills and deficits, did you note that you have issues with heat tolerance? If so, when you're bothered by the heat, it doesn't mean that you have to stay out of the kitchen. Instead, try these ideas. Try using a fan to keep the cool air circulating around you. Sip on cold water while you're preparing and cooking your meal. And it should be noted that there are a variety of personal cooling devices that can be used to keep you cool, including cooling vests, cooling scarves, cooling bracelets. All of these can help you tolerate the heat better. If you have problems with your vision, ask someone to assist you in placing bright colored or raised stickers on your stove and microwave so that you can augment your visual skills. These stickers can increase your ability to discriminate that the device is turned on and off, that the temperatures are set appropriately, and that you can set the timers that are needed during the meal preparation process. You can also use an angled mirror, which is in the bottom left of that screen shot. And the angled mirror goes on the wall behind the stovetop so that if you are seated while preparing your meal, you can actually see into the pots. Pot stabilizers are available for use on the stovetop so that the pots or pans that you're removing do not move off of the burner while you're using the pot. You can also use silicone cooking gloves when completing stovetop or oven cooking so that you don't get burned. Energy conservation principles are very important for people with multiple sclerosis to implement into all of their daily activities. Energy conservation can be defined as an attempt to reduce the amount of energy that is used during a process, thereby leaving more energy for other necessary activities. I urge you to remember and use the 4 Ps. The 4 Ps are prioritize, plan, pace, and position. Prioritize your activities for the day. Think about what has to be done and what can wait until another time. The second P is for plan. Plan means to actually make a plan of attack for what and how you're going to cook. This includes deciding if there are any items that you can fix prior to the actual time. Some of the cooking shows, like Reed Drummond and Ida Gardner, are always talking about making parts of the meal the day before to make it easier on the day of the meal. If they can do it, why don't you? Planning also means making a plan for your cooking that eliminates the need for making extra trips around the kitchen or to the store. The third P is for pace. In this case, slow and steady really does win the race. Make sure to add extra time into your cooking process beyond what is stated on the recipe that allows you to have time for much needed rest breaks. And lastly, the fourth P is for position. Sit as much as possible. This reduces the need to bend and or reach. Both of those activities increase your energy expenditure. When you're preparing and cooking a meal, it is important to find a balance between rest and activity. If it is at all possible, again, try to cook when it is your quote-unquote best time of the day or when you have the most energy. You don't want to be doing a lot of intensive cooking when you've already completed a lot of other energy-depleting activities. Use a kitchen timer as a reminder to take rest breaks. More frequent, shorter rest breaks can be better than one long rest break. Make sure to take a rest break before you actually need it. This will increase your safety and decrease your risk of injury. Pushing yourself to get through that activity can be problematic. It can lead to errors while cooking and safety problems. Okay, so here are just a few examples of adaptive equipment. Adaptive equipment can be as simple or as fancy as you want or need it to be. An occupational therapist can assist you in finding the best matched piece or pieces of adaptive equipment that is available to fit your needs. The top left picture is an example of how you can make an oven rack push-pull stick out of a paint can stir stick. The cutout at the end of the stick is what you use to push the rack into the oven, and the notch on the side is what you would use to pull the oven rack out towards you. The next picture is something to think about if you are planning on doing any kitchen remodeling. It is a cabinet pull-down system that is used in over-counter cabinets to make access to those cabinets easier. Once the rack has been pulled down, you can obtain the item that you need, and then the rack easily goes back into the cabinet and the cabinet door can be closed. This is something that all family members can use. There are many different kinds of adaptive utensils out there for you to try. The one that is pictured here is a rocking tea knife. It is made to use cutting more of a gross motor movement and to compensate for decreased hand strength. The next item is a very fancy, and read into this, very expensive cutting board. I have found other examples of ways to have cutting boards made on Pinterest and on the internet that work just as well and cost much less. The bottom left picture is an item that you might be familiar with. It's called a reacher or grabber picker upper. It can be used to pick up items that you've dropped on the floor. You wouldn't want to use it to pick up something that is heavy, particularly something that is located over your shoulder height because you can drop it. The next item is a battery-powered can opener, and isn't it cute? These take less energy and strength to use than a manual can opener. The next picture on the bottom is a rolling kitchen cart. These can be very helpful when used to help transport items in and around the kitchen. Rolling kitchen carts can be used to take ingredients to your workspace or dishes to the table. The last picture is a kitchen stool. This particular stool has handles on the sides of it that can assist you with sit to and from standing. You can use a stool that you have around the house. Just remember that safety is an important factor to consider when you're thinking about what type of stool is right for you. It should also be noted that a stool with a backrest on it will help you with your overall energy expenditure during meal preparation. I recommend that you ask other people what their experience has been with certain pieces of adaptive equipment before you buy it. As we all know, there are a lot of times that you really do get what you pay for. So you want to make sure you use your money wisely and buy things or make things that work. Another step in this process would be to assess your kitchen. Here are some things to think about. Are there items in the kitchen that you frequently use? Are they located where you can easily and safely get to them and use them? Try to eliminate or reduce the amount of bending and reaching that you have to do while cooking. Make sure that your area where you complete the preparation part of cooking is at the appropriate height for you. If you're sitting, make sure that the counter or table that you're using for your workspace isn't too high. Try and aim for a workspace where your arm movements are at a resting position of around 90 degrees for your elbows and forearm. You don't want to have your shoulders up by your ears either. Is it possible to have the microwave on the countertop instead of over the stove? Would it be possible to put it somewhere that is under counter height if you're in a wheelchair? Another thing to think about in your kitchen is analyzing and setting up a good workflow, something that works for you so you don't have to go back and forth in order to obtain items or complete activities. This can also mean reducing clutter and removing trip hazards that may be in your kitchen. Think about having one area of your kitchen that is set aside for the pots, pans, utensils, etc. that you most frequently use. Let others know that these items need to be put back in this area so that they're there for you to use. Oops. It is also important to analyze the resources that are available to you in your particular community. For example, if you live in a more urban area, are there grocery delivery stores that are available to you? If you live in a more rural area, can you use a car or curb pickup at the grocery store where you go? No matter where you live, if someone offers to help, you can keep a running list of items that you could ask them to pick up for you if they're going to the store. Finally, in order to wrap up this part of the presentation, if you feel like you could benefit from any of the areas that have been presented, remember that help is available. An occupational therapist can assist you in finding ways to maximize your meal planning and preparation skills through the use of adapted equipment, alternative or adapted techniques, organizational skills, and how to implement energy conservation techniques into your daily activities. A physical therapist can assist you with mobility issues, both for in the home and in the community. They can also teach you the proper way to use assistive devices. A speech-language pathologist can help you with high-level cognitive issues that can impact your meal planning and preparation activities. If you feel like you could benefit from any of these services, ask your physician for a referral to the skilled therapy services. Thank you.